You think Grandma shared all her best Christmas recipes? Think again. Behind every holiday table sat dishes so precious, so perfected through generations that the recipes were whispered only on deathbeds, or never shared at all. Let's dig into 30 secret Christmas recipes Grandma refused to share. 7UP pound cake was the secret weapon that made grandmothers famous at church potlucks and Christmas gatherings across the South. The recipe's magic ingredient, a full bottle of lemon-lime soda, created a texture so impossibly moist that neighbors begged for the recipe and were politely refused for decades. Grandmothers mixed butter, sugar, and eggs until fluffy, then alternated flour with the fizzy soda, watching the bubbles work their leavening magic without a single drop of milk. The cake baked low and slow in a bundt pan until golden, emerging with a fine crumb that stayed fresh for days. A simple glaze of powdered sugar and lemon juice crowned the top, pooling into every ridge. Women guarded this recipe fiercely because it won ribbons at county fairs and earned reputations that lasted lifetimes. The soda was the secret nobody admitted. Some even removed labels before baking so curious eyes couldn't discover the truth. This cake proved that sometimes the most guarded recipes held the simplest surprises. Lane cake carried Alabama Christmas traditions in every bourbon-soaked bite, a towering confection that only the most skilled grandmothers dared to attempt. The cake itself was a delicate white layer cake, but the filling made it legendary. A cooked mixture of egg yolks, sugar, butter, raisins, pecans, coconut, and a generous pour of bourbon that aged as the cake rested. Grandmothers started these cakes days before Christmas, letting the bourbon penetrate every layer until the flavors married into something transcendent. The recipe required patience and precision, with the filling cooked slowly to avoid curdling while incorporating each ingredient at exactly the right moment. Topped with fluffy white frosting that hid the boozy treasure inside, Lane cake appeared innocent until that first forkful revealed its complexity. Families argued over whose grandmother made the definitive version, and recipes were altered slightly before sharing to ensure no copy matched the original. This was the cake that made Christmas feel like Christmas. Divinity candy earned its heavenly name and its reputation for breaking hearts in kitchens across the South every December. This ethereal confection required beating hot sugar syrup into stiff egg whites while praying the humidity stayed low enough to let it set properly. Grandmothers checked weather reports before attempting it, knowing that a humid day meant sticky failure no matter how skilled the cook. The syrup had to reach exactly the right temperature. Too cool and the candy stayed soft, too hot and it turned grainy and hard. When everything aligned perfectly, the mixture transformed into glossy white clouds, studded with pecans or cherries, each piece melting on the tongue with pure sweetness. The candy couldn't be rushed or forced, requiring the patience to beat the mixture until it lost its shine and held soft peaks. Grandmothers who mastered Divinity rarely shared their techniques, knowing that the candy's difficulty was part of its Christmas magic. Japanese fruitcake had nothing to do with Japan. This southern Christmas tradition earned its exotic name from the spiced raisin and coconut filling that seemed foreign to early 20th century palates. 3 layers alternated between plain white cake and spiced cake, dark with cinnamon, allspice, cloves, and raisins, all bound together with a thick coconut filling cooked until it spread like sweet cement. The filling recipe was the guarded treasure, requiring fresh coconut grated by hand before packaged flakes existed, combined with sugar and enough liquid to create the right consistency. Grandmothers started days ahead, baking layers and preparing filling, then assembling the towering cake that needed time for flavors to meld. The cake improved over several days, making it perfect for Christmas Eve preparation and Christmas Day serving. Churches held competitions where Japanese fruitcake entries were judged with fierce seriousness. This cake represented Southern baking tradition meeting Christmas celebration at its finest. Charlotte Roose appeared on Christmas dessert tables as edible elegance, ladyfinger-lined molds filled with Bavarian cream and crowned with whipped cream rosettes. Grandmothers learned this French-inspired dessert from their own mothers, who learned it from theirs, each generation adding small refinements while keeping the essential technique secret. The ladyfingers had to be homemade and perfectly crisp, arranged vertically around the mold's sides like delicate fencing. The filling required gelatin bloomed in cold water, custard cooked without curdling, and whipped cream folded with precision to maintain airiness. The assembled dessert chilled overnight, unmolded with held breath onto crystal plates, and decorated with candied violets or cherries. When it worked, Charlotte Roose quivered delicately with each slice, the cream spilling gently from its ladyfinger walls. This wasn't everyday dessert, it was Christmas showing off, the recipe shared only with daughters deemed worthy of continuing the tradition. Date nut bread emerged from Christmas kitchens wrapped in wax paper and ribbon, given as gifts that neighbors anticipated all year long. The bread required soaking chopped dates in boiling water until they softened into sticky sweetness, then folding them into a batter rich with brown sugar, eggs, and walnuts or pecans. Baked in coffee cans or loaf pans, the bread developed a dense, moist texture that improved over several days of aging wrapped tightly in the pantry. Grandmothers sliced it thin and spread cream cheese between layers, creating tea sandwiches that appeared at holiday open houses. The recipe's simplicity belied its perfection. The ratio of dates to nuts to batter determined whether the bread emerged sublime or merely acceptable. Women who made exceptional date nut bread found themselves baking dozens of loaves each December, their reputation demanding they share their creation while protecting the exact proportions. This was humble bread elevated to Christmas tradition. Brown sugar fudge carried caramel richness that chocolate fudge couldn't touch, a candy so temperamental that its success proved a grandmother's skill beyond doubt. The recipe demanded precise temperatures and perfect timing. Brown sugar, cream, and butter cooked to the soft ball stage, then beaten by hand until the mixture lost its gloss and began to set. Pour too early, and the fudge stayed sauce. Beat too long, and it turned grainy. Grandmothers tested doneness by dropping bits into cold water, feeling the texture between their fingers to know the exact moment to remove the pot from heat. The resulting candy had a texture between creamy and chewy, with deep butterscotch flavor that lingered on the tongue. Pecans were pressed into the top before cutting into squares, each piece wrapped in wax paper for Christmas cookie tins. Women who mastered brown sugar fudge earned reputations passed down through generations, their technique observed but never quite duplicated by those who watched. Bourbon balls required no baking yet demanded precision that separated the legendary from the merely acceptable. These no-bake confections combined crushed vanilla wafers, powdered sugar, cocoa, corn syrup, and bourbon into a mixture rolled into small spheres and coated in more powdered sugar or chocolate. The bourbon had to be good enough to drink, and the amount determined whether the balls tasted elegantly boozy or overwhelmingly alcoholic. Grandmothers let them age in tins for weeks before Christmas, the flavors mellowing and melding until each bite delivered perfect balance. The texture had to be firm enough to hold shape, yet soft enough to yield immediately when bitten. Some grandmothers added pecans, others kept theirs pure. The recipe seemed simple enough to share, but somehow the copies never matched the original, perhaps because grandmothers left out crucial details about resting times or ingredient temperatures. These were grown-up Christmas treats that children remembered eagerly awaiting adulthood to finally taste. Sock-it-to-me cake dominated Southern Christmas mornings with its cinnamon streusel swirl and buttery sour cream texture. The name came from the 1960s catchphrase, but the cake's appeal was timeless. A bundt cake with a ribbon of brown sugar, cinnamon, and pecans running through its center, discovered with each slice like buried treasure. Grandmothers creamed butter and sugar until impossibly light, then added sour cream for moisture that kept the cake tender for days. The streusel mixture was layered carefully. Half the batter poured first, then the cinnamon filling, then the remaining batter, all swirled gently with a knife to create marbled patterns. A simple glaze of powdered sugar and milk drizzled over the warm cake, seeping into cracks and pooling on the plate. This was Christmas breakfast cake, served with strong coffee while presents waited beneath the tree. The recipe seemed available everywhere, yet somehow only certain grandmothers achieved transcendence. Italian cream cake appeared at Christmas tables across the South, despite having no Italian heritage whatsoever. The name simply sounded elegant enough for the holiday's finest dessert. 3 layers of tender white cake enriched with buttermilk, coconut, and pecans rose tall before being covered in cream cheese frosting that balanced the cake's sweetness. The butter had to be room temperature, the eggs separated with whites beaten stiff and folded in last for lift. Toasted coconut and pecans studded both the cake layers and the frosting, creating texture in every bite. Grandmothers who made exceptional Italian cream cake became known for it. Their versions requested at every family gathering until the recipe became their identity. The cake required advanced planning, toasting coconut, tempering cream cheese, ensuring ingredients reached proper temperatures, and grandmothers used this complexity to justify keeping secrets. This was the cake that ended Christmas dinner, the one everyone saved room for despite already being stuffed. Ambrosia was Christmas in a crystal bowl, but the real version bore no resemblance to the sugary canned fruit imposters that later claimed its name. True ambrosia required cracking fresh coconuts, draining the milk, and grating the white flesh by hand until knuckles ached, a task grandmothers began days before Christmas. Fresh navel oranges were peeled and sectioned with precision, every bit of bitter pith removed before the segments joined the coconut. Some grandmothers added only powdered sugar, others folded in fresh pineapple or cherries for color. The mixture rested overnight, allowing the coconut to soften and the flavors to marry into something ethereal. No sour cream, no marshmallows, no whipped topping. Those additions marked recipes as corrupted imitations. The real ambrosia was light, fresh, and tasted like winter sunshine captured in a spoon. Grandmothers who remembered cracking coconuts on back porches guarded this simplicity fiercely, knowing that shortcuts destroyed what made the dish divine. White fruitcake stood apart from its maligned dark cousin, a pale and elegant confection that converted even committed fruitcake haters into believers. The cake contained no molasses, no dark spices, no candied citron, only golden pineapple, pale cherries, white raisins, almonds, and coconuts suspended in tender butter cake. The batter was mixed gently to keep the fruit distributed evenly, then baked low and slow until a toothpick emerged clean. Unlike dark fruitcake that needed months of bourbon soaking, white fruitcake was ready within days, though it improved with time wrapped tightly and refrigerated. Grandmothers glazed the tops with corn syrup and arranged pecan halves in decorative patterns, creating cakes almost too beautiful to slice. This was the fruitcake served to important guests, the one that appeared at church gatherings where reputations were made. The recipe required expensive ingredients and careful technique, both of which grandmothers protected from those who hadn't earned the knowledge. Pralines represented New Orleans Christmas traditions carried into homes across the South, each batch a gamble between crystalline perfection and grainy failure. The candy required cooking sugar, cream, and butter to exactly the right temperature while stirring constantly to prevent scorching, a process demanding full attention and strong arms. Pecans were stirred in at the last moment before the mixture was spooned onto wax paper in pools that spread and set into sandy textured rounds. The texture had to be right, not too hard, not too soft, dissolving on the tongue into buttery pecan sweetness. Humidity affected every batch, as did altitude and stove calibration. Grandmothers who consistently produced perfect pralines were considered practitioners of culinary magic, their intuition about timing impossible to teach through recipes alone. The candy appeared in Christmas tins alongside other sweets, but pralines were always grabbed first, their buttery fragrance announcing their presence the moment lids were lifted. Fresh coconut cake towered on cake stands at Christmas dinners, 7-minute frosting billowing like snow around layers studded with hand-grated coconut. The process began with selecting coconuts at the market, shaking each to hear the milk slosh inside, rejecting any that sounded hollow or dry. Cracking the shell required hammers and determination, and prying the meat from its brown skin tested patience before the grating even began. The cake layers themselves were tender white cake, but the frosting made the dessert, egg whites and sugar beaten over simmering water until they formed glossy peaks that held their shape. Fresh coconut was pressed into the frosting while still tacky, covering every surface until the cake resembled a snowball. The finished cake needed to rest, the coconut softening slightly and absorbing moisture from the frosting. This was all-day work, sometimes two-day work, and grandmothers measured love in the hours spent creating this masterpiece. Caramel cake required nerve, skill, and a willingness to stand over a bubbling pot of molten sugar long after arms begged for rest. The caramel frosting was the challenge. Sugar cooked dry until it melted and darkened to amber, then shocked with butter and cream that sputtered dangerously before being beaten into submission. The timing was everything. Caramel taken too dark turned bitter, not dark enough remained merely sweet without the deep complexity that defined the real thing. The frosting had to be spread quickly before it set, worked across layers while still pourable yet thick enough to stay in place. Grandmothers who mastered caramel cake often bore small burn scars on their forearms, badges of honor from battles with the volatile frosting. The finished cake sat amber and glossy, the interior layers visible through the translucent caramel. This wasn't a recipe shared casually. It was earned through apprenticeship, standing beside grandmother, watching her hands. Pecan tassis filled miniature muffin tins with bite-sized pecan pies, each one a perfect two-bite treasure that disappeared from Christmas cookie trays first. The cream cheese pastry shells required chilling before being pressed into tiny cups, the dough soft enough to work but firm enough to hold its shape. The filling was simplified pecan pie, brown sugar, butter, eggs, and vanilla, poured over a few pecan pieces nestled in each shell. The tassis baked until the pastry turned golden, and the filling set with just a slight wobble in the center. Unmolding them required patience. Too soon and they crumbled, too long in the pan and they stuck. Grandmothers made dozens of these, sometimes hundreds, for church bazaars and neighborhood cookie exchanges where they commanded premium trades. The recipe seemed straightforward enough, but somehow grandmother's tassis always tasted better, perhaps because she didn't mention the extra splash of vanilla or the way she pressed the dough just so. Syllabub appeared in punch bowls at Christmas Eve gatherings, a frothy cream and wine concoction that dated back centuries before disappearing from modern tables. Fresh cream was beaten with sugar and sherry or Madeira until it foamed and thickened into something between whipped cream and eggnog. The mixture was spooned over sponge cake fingers or served in small glasses, each portion capped with nutmeg and meant to be consumed slowly while the cream gradually separated from the wine below. Making proper syllabub required understanding the chemistry. Too much beating and the cream turned to butter, too little, and it remained merely liquid. Grandmothers learned from their grandmothers who learned from theirs, the recipe traveling through generations mostly by demonstration rather than written instruction. By the 1970s, syllabub had nearly vanished from Christmas tables, remembered only by elderly aunts who mourned its loss while younger generations wondered what they were missing. Boiled custard flowed from pitchers into cups at Christmas gatherings, a pourable vanilla custard that Southerners considered essential to holiday celebrations. The recipe demanded patience: eggs, sugar, and milk cooked slowly in a double boiler, stirred constantly until the mixture thickened enough to coat a spoon without ever approaching a boil that would curdle everything into sweet scrambled eggs. Vanilla extract was added only after the custard cooled, preserving its delicate flavor from heat that would cook it away. Some grandmothers served it warm, others chilled it overnight. Children drank it from cups, while adults sometimes added bourbon, creating an eggnog-adjacent drink without the egg foam. The custard appeared at open houses, church gatherings, and family dinners, its presence announcing that Christmas had officially arrived. Grandmothers who made silky boiled custard without a single curdled bit were respected for their patience and skill, their technique watched closely by daughters hoping to someday match it. Rum cake emerged from bundt pans glistening with butter rum glaze, a boozy dessert that adults anticipated all year long. The cake itself was rich with sour cream and pudding mix, but the glaze transformed it. Butter, sugar, and dark rum cooked together, then poured slowly over the warm cake, seeping into every crevice and pooling on the plate. The rum had to be good quality, Cheap rum produced harsh medicinal flavors that ruined the entire creation. Grandmothers poked holes in the warm cake with skewers, ensuring the glaze penetrated deeply rather than just coating the surface. The cake improved over several days, the rum mellowing and the texture becoming increasingly dense and moist. By Christmas Day, each slice was practically pudding, fork tender and aromatic with rum that hit the nose before the first bite. This wasn't a cake for children, and grandmothers kept the recipe from daughters-in-law they hadn't yet decided to trust. Peanut brittle shattered into golden shards across kitchen counters, each piece a perfect balance of crunchy caramelized sugar and roasted peanuts. The candy required cooking sugar and corn syrup to the hard crack stage while ensuring the peanuts didn't burn, a delicate balance that separated experienced candy makers from hopeful amateurs. Baking soda was stirred in at the last moment, creating the tiny air bubbles that gave brittle its characteristic texture and made it shatter rather than stick to teeth. The molten mixture was poured onto buttered slabs and stretched thin while still pliable, working quickly before the candy set. Grandmothers who made exceptional brittle could stretch it paper thin, the peanuts visible through the amber candy like fossils in glass. The snapping sound of properly made brittle breaking into pieces was Christmas music, announcing that the candy had achieved perfection. Recipes were shared, but the intuition about timing and temperature remained with those who had made hundreds of batches. Mincemeat pie carried centuries of Christmas tradition in every spiced bite, though the filling had long abandoned actual meat in favor of fruits and suet that honored the dish's medieval origins. True homemade mincemeat required months of preparation: apples, raisins, currants, citrus peel, brown sugar, spices, and beef suet macerated together in brandy until the flavors melded into something complex and boozy. Grandmothers started their mincemeat in autumn, stirring the jar weekly and adding more spirits as the mixture absorbed what came before. By Christmas, the filling had transformed into concentrated holiday flavor, spooned into pastry shells and baked until the crust turned golden. The taste was unlike anything else: sweet, tart, spicy, and rich, with the depth that only time could create. Store-bought mincemeat tasted thin and harsh by comparison, missing the patience that made grandmother's version legendary. This pie divided families between those who waited all year for their slice and those who never understood its appeal. Spiced pecans emerged from ovens in waves of cinnamon sugar fragrance, each batch claimed by eager hands before they could fully cool. The recipe seemed simple: pecans tossed with egg white, sugar, cinnamon, and salt, then baked until crisp. But execution determined whether the result was transcendent or merely acceptable. The egg white coating had to be even, the sugar mixture perfectly balanced, and the baking time precise enough to crisp without burning. Grandmothers roasted their pecans low and slow, stirring occasionally to ensure even browning, filling homes with an aroma that announced Christmas had arrived. The finished nuts were addictive, each one leading inevitably to another, until the bowl sat empty and accusations flew about who had taken more than their share. These appeared in crystal dishes on coffee tables, in decorative tins given as gifts, and in secret stashes hidden by grandmothers who knew their own weakness. The recipe was shared freely, but grandmother's batches remained unmatched. Fruitcake cookies condensed all the flavors of traditional fruitcake into bite-sized morsels that converted even devoted fruitcake skeptics. The dough was rich with butter, brown sugar, and spices, studded with candied cherries, pineapple, dates, and pecans in proportions that varied by family tradition. Unlike their dense cake cousin, these cookies were soft and chewy, with fruit-to-dough ratios that ensured every bite contained multiple treasures. Grandmothers baked dozens of these in the weeks before Christmas, storing them in tins where they aged and mellowed, improving daily until Christmas arrived. The cookies were traded at cookie exchanges where they often commanded multiple trades from those who recognized their superiority. Children who claimed to hate fruitcake would eat these without complaint, never connecting the flavors to the maligned dessert. The recipe appeared simple on paper but required intuition about dough consistency and fruit distribution that came only from years of practice. Eggnog pie transformed the beloved holiday drink into a silky custard nestled in graham cracker crust, topped with clouds of whipped cream and freshly grated nutmeg. The filling required cooking eggs, sugar, and cream with gelatin until thickened, then folding in stiffly whipped cream that gave the pie its characteristic lightness. Bourbon or rum was essential. Grandmothers who omitted it produced pies that tasted flat and childish rather than festive. The balance of spices mattered too. Too much nutmeg overwhelmed, too little disappeared. The pie needed hours to set properly, the filling firming just enough to slice cleanly while still melting on the tongue. Grandmothers served these at Christmas dinner, each slice crowned with additional whipped cream and a final dusting of nutmeg that perfumed the air above the plate. This wasn't a pie for casual occasions. It was Christmas crystallized into dessert form, appearing once yearly to remind everyone what the season tasted like. Chess squares adapted the traditional chess pie into bar cookie form, creating portable bites of caramelized sugar that disappeared from Christmas trays within hours. The base was simple butter crust pressed into pans, topped with a filling of eggs, sugar, butter, and vanilla, beaten until smooth and poured over the crust. During baking, the top formed a thin, crackled crust, while the interior stayed gooey and rich, almost like the center of an underbaked brownie, but purely sugar rather than chocolate. The squares were cut small because their sweetness demanded moderation, though few managed to stop at just one. Grandmothers made these when they needed quantity without excessive effort, producing dozens from a single batch that satisfied crowds at church socials and family gatherings. The recipe traveled well, the squares sturdy enough to transport without crumbling, yet tender enough to yield immediately when bitten. This was Southern Christmas baking at its most efficient and delicious. Wassail simmered on stovetops and in slow cookers throughout December, filling homes with the warm spice aroma that meant Christmas had officially arrived. The drink combined fresh apple cider with orange juice, cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, and allspice berries, sometimes spiked with brandy or rum for adults seeking extra warmth. The mixture needed hours of gentle warming that allowed the spices to infuse deeply without becoming bitter or harsh. Grandmothers served wassail from crystal punch bowls or ladled it directly into ceramic mugs for guests arriving chilled from December cold. The warmth spread through the body, the spices lingering long after cups sat empty on tables. Every family's wassail tasted different, the result of varied spice ratios and secret additions like vanilla or maple syrup. This was Christmas hospitality in liquid form, offered to carolers and neighbors who gathered around its warmth. Sand tarts were paper-thin sugar cookies that shattered with the first bite, scattering buttery crumbs across holiday tablecloths and crystal serving platters. The dough required extensive chilling before being rolled impossibly thin, almost translucent, then cut into festive shapes and brushed with egg white before being sprinkled with cinnamon sugar. Baking demanded absolute vigilance. Mere seconds separated golden perfection from burnt failure when cookies this thin met the oven's heat. Grandmothers made hundreds throughout December, the rolling and cutting taking entire afternoons while Christmas carols played and children watched. The finished cookies were delicate as spun glass, stored carefully in layers of wax paper to prevent shattering before serving. These weren't the soft, thick cookies children usually preferred. They were sophisticated adult cookies, elegant and restrained, best with coffee. Molasses crinkles emerged from ovens with surfaces cracked like dried earth, each fissure revealing the soft spiced interior beneath the sugary crust that gave them their distinctive and memorable look. The dough was dark with robust molasses, warm with ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, rolled in granulated sugar before baking that created the signature crinkled appearance everyone recognized. The cookies were soft when warm, firming slightly as they cooled, but never becoming hard or crunchy. Grandmothers timed their batches to emerge just before guests arrived, the aroma alone announcing that fresh Christmas cookies awaited anyone who entered the kitchen. The flavor was deeply nostalgic, the taste of Christmases past in each spiced bite. Children loved the sweetness, adults appreciated the molasses depth. This was old-fashioned Christmas baking, unchanged because perfection needed no improvement. Fefanus were tiny spiced German cookies that appeared in Christmas tins across communities where immigrant traditions held strong through many generations of families. The cookies were barely larger than marbles, dense with honey, molasses, and spices that always included black pepper, providing the subtle heat beneath the sweetness that gave the cookie its distinctive German name. After baking, cookies were rolled in powdered sugar like fresh fallen snow, each one a perfect bite of concentrated Christmas flavor. The dough was stiff, the honey and molasses creating density that lighter American cookies couldn't match. Grandmothers made massive batches, knowing they improved with age. Tins of Fefanus were given as gifts, their small size making them seem abundant. These weren't American cookies, they were heritage preserved, connecting descendants to ancestors who carried recipes across the ocean. Chocolate fudge with walnuts filled Christmas tins alongside other candies, its glossy surface representing the pinnacle of homemade holiday confection for generations of dedicated home cooks. The process demanded precision. Sugar, cocoa, butter, and milk cooked to exact temperature, then beaten by hand until the mixture lost its shine and began to set properly. Pour too soon and fudge stayed soft forever. Wait too long and it turned grainy and crumbly. Walnuts were stirred in last, their mild bitterness balancing intense chocolate sweetness perfectly. Grandmothers who mastered fudge were rare, their success rate high enough to attempt the temperamental candy without anxiety. The finished fudge was cut into squares, each piece dense enough that one satisfied chocolate cravings completely. This was Christmas candy at its most traditional, appearing on tables exactly as it had for generations. Harvard Beets brought deep crimson elegance to holiday tables, their sweet and sour glaze glistening like rubies under dining room lights. The dish took its name from the university whose color it matched, though the connection ended there. Cooks sliced cooked beets into rounds, then simmered them in sauce of sugar, cornstarch, vinegar, and butter until the glaze thickened and coated each piece. The result was simultaneously sweet and tangy, earthiness balanced by bright acidity. Some recipes called for orange zest or cloves, adding complexity to the straightforward preparation. The vibrant color made Harvard Beets a visual dream, adding drama to tables dominated by browns and beiges. Children often resisted at first, but the sweet glaze converted many skeptics. This was practical cooking too, as canned beets worked perfectly fine when fresh ones were unavailable during winter. Harvard Beets represented an era when vegetables were dressed up for company, transformed from everyday nutrition into worthy holiday companions. Popcorn balls were the Christmas treats that appeared at holiday parties and hung from trees as edible decorations, spheres of popped corn held together with molasses or sugar syrup. The process required freshly popped corn, no kernels, no old maids, mixed quickly with hot syrup before the mixture cooled and became unworkable. Cooks buttered their hands and shaped the sticky mass into balls, while heat made their palms tingle. Some recipes used molasses for dark, chewy popcorn balls. Others used clear sugar syrup for lighter versions that sparkled. Red food coloring made festive Christmas balls, while green created holiday trees when molded into cone shapes. The treats were wrapped in cellophane and tied with ribbons for gifting or display. Children helped make popcorn balls, learning to work quickly and tolerate sticky fingers. The tradition connected Christmas to harvest abundance, corn being the American grain. Though commercial versions exist today, homemade popcorn balls carried the warmth of kitchens and hands that shaped them. Crackling cornbread emerged from cast-iron skillets at Christmas dinners, where wheat flour was too expensive and leftover pork scraps needed purpose. The cracklings, crispy bits of rendered pork fat and skin, were folded into cornmeal batter, adding richness and texture that transformed simple bread into something special. The batter was poured into a skillet greased with lard and preheated until smoking, creating a crust that shattered when cut. Inside, the cornbread stayed moist and tender, studded with salty, chewy cracklings that delivered bursts of pork flavor in every bite. The bread accompanied whatever else appeared on the table, soaking up gravies and pot liquors that might otherwise go to waste. Making crackling cornbread used every part of the hog, wasting nothing in kitchens where waste was unthinkable. Children fought over the corner pieces with the most crust. Crackling cornbread represented ingenuity, the transformation of scraps into something eagerly anticipated. Fruitcake was the dense, boozy loaf that divided families into passionate defenders and determined avoiders, its candied fruits and nuts soaked in brandy for months. Bakers began preparation in autumn, combining dried fruits, nuts, and spices into batters that were baked slowly, then wrapped in brandy-soaked cheesecloth to age until Christmas. The cakes were heavy and dark, each slice revealing jewel-toned fruits suspended in rich, spiced crumb. Families who loved fruitcake guarded recipes passed down through generations. The cakes were given as gifts, arriving in tins that were either treasured or quietly regifted. The flavor was complex, sweet, boozy, spiced, and intensely fruity in ways that demanded appreciation. By the 1980s, fruitcake had become a punchline, mocked as the gift nobody wanted. Yet for those who grew up with homemade versions, the jokes missed the point entirely. Real fruitcake aged properly was a taste of Christmas tradition. Glorified rice transformed leftover grain into a festive dessert salad that children begged for and adults secretly loved just as much. Cold-cooked rice was folded with crushed pineapple, miniature marshmallows, maraschino cherries, and whipped cream until it became unrecognizable from its humble origins. Some versions added chopped nuts or coconut for texture, while others kept the base simple. The dish needed thorough chilling, allowing flavors to meld and rice to soften in the creamy mixture. Served in crystal bowls, glorified rice looked almost bridal, pale and dotted with bright cherry red. The sweetness made it controversial as a side dish, yet families insisted it belonged alongside turkey and gravy. This was thrift elevated to celebration, using rice that might otherwise go to waste. Mothers passed down specific ratios, each family believing their version superior. Glorified rice represented an era when creativity with basics was celebrated, when making something from nothing was its own form of kitchen magic. Charlotte Russe was the elegant Christmas dessert that arrived in individual servings, each one a small tower of Bavarian cream surrounded by ladyfingers and topped with whipped cream. The dessert required patience and skill. The cream filling had to be made from scratch, cooked custard folded with whipped cream and set with gelatin until it held its shape. Ladyfingers were arranged around the inside of molds, standing upright like soldiers guarding the creamy center. Once unmolded, the charlottes looked like something from a French pastry shop, impossibly refined for home kitchens. Families served them at Christmas dinner parties where impressing guests mattered. The cream was delicate, barely sweet, flavored with vanilla or sometimes a splash of rum. Each spoonful combined the soft cookie texture of ladyfingers with the airy richness of the filling. Charlotte Russe represented the height of homemade elegance, proof that American cooks could match European sophistication when the occasion demanded their finest efforts. Pickled pig's feet sat in jars on Christmas tables as appetizers and accompaniments, the preserved feet providing protein and gelatin that had been prepared weeks earlier. The feet were cleaned, boiled until tender, then packed into jars with vinegar, spices, and onions that preserved and flavored them simultaneously. The pickling liquid turned slightly gelatinous from collagen released during cooking, and the meat became tangy and tender. Families served pickled pig's feet cold, the meat pulled from bones and eaten with fingers or forks. The dish was economical. Feet cost almost nothing at the butcher, and the preservation meant it could be prepared well ahead of the holiday rush. Children either loved or avoided the strange texture, while adults appreciated both the flavor and the tradition. Pickled pig's feet represented the practical wisdom of preparing ahead, using preservation to transform cheap cuts into Christmas delicacies. Ambrosia salad was the fluffy, sweet concoction that straddled the line between side dish and dessert, its marshmallows and coconut creating something uniquely American. Canned mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, and maraschino cherries were folded with miniature marshmallows, shredded coconut, and sour cream. The mixture was chilled overnight, allowing flavors to meld and marshmallows to soften. Served in cut glass bowls, the pastel colors seemed appropriately festive. Children especially loved ambrosia, often requesting second helpings despite protests about ruining their appetite. The dish required no cooking, making it perfect for busy kitchens where oven space was precious. Some families added pecans or used cottage cheese, each variation reflecting regional preferences. Ambrosia has largely disappeared from Christmas tables, dismissed as too sweet and artificial, but for decades it was a beloved tradition that children anticipated all year. Eggnog pie was the Christmas dessert that captured the season's signature drink in a slice, a creamy custard flavored with nutmeg, vanilla, and often a splash of bourbon or rum. The filling was essentially eggnog thickened with eggs and baked until just set, wobbling slightly when the pie emerged from the oven. The crust was typically simple pastry, though some cooks used graham cracker or ginger snap crusts for added spice. Fresh nutmeg grated over the top added both flavor and visual appeal. Families served eggnog pie chilled, often with whipped cream that melted slowly into the silky filling. The dessert was practical. It could be made days ahead and stored in the refrigerator, freeing oven space for Christmas Day cooking. For those who loved eggnog but wanted something to eat rather than drink, this pie delivered the same comforting flavors in a new form that satisfied holiday cravings. Pickled peaches were jeweled accompaniments that appeared beside Christmas hams, their spiced sweetness providing perfect counterpoint to rich meats. Canned peach halves were simmered in syrup infused with whole cloves, cinnamon sticks, and apple cider vinegar until they absorbed warm spices completely. The peaches emerged tender and glossy, their golden flesh tinged with amber from the spiced brine. Packed into jars, they could be preserved for months, ready to grace holiday tables whenever needed. Each peach half was studded with whole cloves, making them look almost decorative, edible ornaments for the dinner plate. The flavor was complex, simultaneously sweet, tart, and warmly spiced in ways that elevated simple sliced ham. Grandmothers often made these in late summer when fresh peaches were cheap, though canned versions worked nearly as well. Pickled peaches represented the tradition of putting up preserves, ensuring summer's sweetness could brighten even the darkest winter meals. Squirrel stew bubbled on Christmas stovetops in Appalachian homes where hunting provided what wages couldn't. The small game animals transformed into rich, satisfying meals through patience and skill. Hunters brought home squirrels by the dozen throughout autumn, and the fattest ones were saved for holiday cooking. The animals were cleaned and jointed, then browned in bacon drippings before being covered with water and simmered for hours with potatoes, onions, and wild herbs gathered from nearby woods. The meat became tender and flavorful, its slightly gamey taste mellowed by long cooking and balanced by vegetables. Families gathered around large pots, ladling stew into bowls and using cornbread to soak up the rich gravy. Children grew up considering squirrel stew a holiday treat, never knowing that wealthier families might have looked down on such fare. The dish represented mountain self-reliance, the ability to provide Christmas dinner through skill with a rifle rather than money at the store. Baked Alaska was the show-stopping dessert that proved a cook's mastery, its dome of meringue concealing ice cream that somehow survived a hot oven. The construction was engineering: sponge cake base, firmly frozen ice cream shaped into a dome, then completely covered in meringue that was quickly browned in an extremely hot oven. The meringue insulated the ice cream, allowing the outside to turn golden while the inside stayed frozen. Slicing revealed the dramatic layers: brown meringue, white ice cream, golden cake. The presentation caused gasps around Christmas tables. Making baked Alaska required precise timing and temperature control, with no room for error. Families reserved it for the most special occasions, when impressing guests was paramount. The dessert represented the era's love of dramatic presentations and technical challenges. Baked Alaska has largely vanished from home kitchens, surviving in occasional restaurant appearances where few remember its former holiday glory. Beans and cornbread made Christmas dinner in homes where meat was unthinkable luxury, the combination providing complete protein that kept bodies strong through winter's coldest days. Dried beans, pintos, Great Northerns, or whatever variety was cheapest, soaked overnight before simmering all day with onion and salt. The cornbread baked in cast iron, its bottom crust crackling and golden from the preheated skillet. Together, Beans and cornbread created a meal that was both filling and nutritious, the amino acids from each combining to provide what neither could alone. Families ladled beans into bowls and crumbled cornbread on top, the bread soaking up the bean liquor until it became almost like dumplings. The meal cost pennies but delivered satisfaction that expensive dishes couldn't match. Beans and cornbread represented survival, the understanding that celebration didn't require wealth, only the wisdom to use humble ingredients well. Japanese fruitcake had nothing to do with Japan. The name remains a mystery, but the cake itself was pure Southern Christmas tradition. 3 or 4 spice cake layers alternated with coconut-filled layers, the whole construction held together by a boiled white frosting, studded with fresh coconut and sometimes raisins. The spice layers were dark with cinnamon, allspice, cloves, and nutmeg, while the white layers stayed pale and tender. Between each layer went the filling, a cooked mixture of coconut, sugar, and sometimes crushed pineapple that added moisture and tropical sweetness. The finished cake was massive, often requiring a special stand to display properly at holiday gatherings. Slicing revealed the dramatic contrast between dark and light layers, each bite offering different flavors and textures. Grandmothers guarded their Japanese fruitcake recipes, passing them to daughters who continued the tradition. The cake required an entire day to assemble properly, but lasted through the holiday week. Spiced crab apples were the garnish that elevated holiday platters from ordinary to elegant, their deep ruby color and clove-studded skins announcing celebration. Whole crab apples were simmered in sweetened vinegar syrup infused with cinnamon sticks, cloves, and allspice until they turned translucent and tender. The fruits were packed into jars with their spiced liquid and stored for weeks, improving as flavors concentrated. Come Christmas, they were arranged around roasts and hams like edible jewels, their glossy skins catching candlelight beautifully. The taste was intensely sweet tart, with warming spice notes that complemented rich meats. Some families made their own from backyard trees, while others relied on store-bought versions. Children often avoided them, but adults treasured spiced crab apples as essential holiday tradition. The jars themselves became gifts, wrapped in ribbon for neighbors. Spiced crab apples represented the artistry of preservation, autumn's harvest transformed into winter's ornament. Suet pudding was the heavy, warming dessert that sustained families through cold Christmas seasons, a steamed cake made with beef suet that provided richness no butter could match. The suet was grated fine and mixed with flour, breadcrumbs, sugar, dried fruits, and spices, then packed into molds and steamed for hours until dense and fragrant. The fat melted during cooking, creating pockets of moisture throughout the pudding that kept it tender for days. Unlike modern desserts that aimed for lightness, suet pudding was meant to stick to ribs and provide warmth during the coldest months. Families served it with hard sauce, custard, or simply a drizzle of cream. The tradition came from England, where Suet puddings had fed working families for centuries. American cooks continued making them through the early 20th century before vegetable shortenings replaced animal fats in most kitchens. Those who remember Suet pudding recall its unique texture and satisfying heaviness that no modern dessert replicates. Molasses cake emerged from ovens on Christmas morning in homes where refined sugar was too expensive, the dark sweetener providing depth of flavor that white sugar couldn't match. Flour, molasses, eggs, and spices were beaten together and baked until the cake rose and set, its surface dark and fragrant with the smell of ginger and warm spices. The flavor was complex, sweet but with bitter undertones, spicy from ginger and cinnamon that enhanced the molasses rather than competing with it. The cake was served plain or with a simple glaze, its dense texture satisfying in ways that lighter cakes couldn't be. Molasses was affordable because it was a byproduct of sugar refining, making it the sweetener poor families relied on throughout the year. The cake could be baked ahead and stored, improving with age as the flavors melded together. Molasses cake represented making virtue of necessity, discovering that cheaper ingredients could produce results as satisfying as expensive ones. Let's dig into 30 Christmas dinners from those decades that have completely disappeared. Crown roast of pork was the showstopper centerpiece that announced a family's prosperity and a mother's skill the moment guests entered the dining room. Butchers would French the rib bones and curve them into a majestic crown shape, each bone tip adorned with a paper frill that made the roast look almost too elegant to eat. The center was filled with savory stuffing, often bread-based with apples, onions, and sage, that cooked inside the meat, absorbing all those rich pork juices. Families ordered these roasts weeks in advance from local butchers who knew exactly how to prepare them. The presentation was theatrical, carried to the table on the best silver platter while everyone gasped and applauded. Carving required precision, with the host carefully separating each chop while keeping the crown intact as long as possible. The meat was succulent, the stuffing rich, and the experience unforgettable. Crown roast represented an era when Christmas dinner was performance as much as meal, when presentation mattered deeply. Hoppin John carried good luck wishes into Christmas dinner across the South, the combination of black-eyed peas and rice symbolizing coins and prosperity for the coming year. The dish cost almost nothing to prepare. Dried peas soaked overnight, rice bought in bulk, and whatever pork scraps the kitchen held. A ham hock or piece of fatback simmered with the peas, infusing them with smoky richness while the rice cooked separately. The two were combined on plates, the peas spooned over fluffy rice and topped with cooking liquid that had become thick and flavorful. Families ate Hoppin John believing it would bring fortune, the superstition adding meaning to a meal that poverty might otherwise have made shameful. Children were taught to eat every pea on their plate to ensure the luck would stick. Hoppin John represented hope dressed as dinner, the belief that better times lay ahead even when the present offered only beans and rice. Plum pudding with hard sauce was the dramatic finale to Victorian and early American Christmas dinners, a dessert demanding weeks of preparation that arrived flaming with brandy. Despite the name, no plums appeared. The term referred to dried fruits like raisins, currants, and candied peel studding the dense, steamed cake. Suet provided richness, breadcrumbs gave structure, and eggs bound everything with brown sugar, spices, and enough spirits to preserve the pudding for months. The mixture was packed into cloth-lined molds and steamed for hours, then stored until Christmas, when it was steamed again. The hard sauce, butter whipped with powdered sugar, vanilla, and brandy until fluffy, melted over the warm pudding, creating pools of sweetness. The serving moment was theatrical, with blue flames dancing across the surface as brandy was ignited. Families gathered in wonder, watching fire burn off before slicing into the dark, fragrant dessert that connected them to centuries of tradition. Squash casserole was Southern comfort baked golden, turning summer's yellow crookneck squash into a dish hearty enough for winter celebrations. Sliced squash was simmered until tender, then mashed with eggs, butter, and sugar until almost custard-like. Crushed crackers topped the mixture, browning into crispy crust during baking that contrasted beautifully with creamy interior. The natural sweetness of squash intensified with cooking, making this acceptable to children who might refuse vegetables. Some recipes added cheese for savory depth, while others emphasized sweetness. The dish could be assembled ahead, requiring only baking before serving. Squash casserole represented the Southern tradition of treating vegetables as worthy of indulgent preparation, butter and eggs transforming humble squash into something memorable. Date nut bread appeared in Christmas kitchens when cooks wanted something special that wasn't quite cake and wasn't quite bread, a sweet loaf perfect for breakfast or afternoon tea. The batter came together quickly. Chopped dates were softened in hot water or coffee, then mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and generous handfuls of walnuts or pecans. The loaves baked slowly in narrow pans, emerging dark and fragrant with tender crumb that sliced cleanly. Some recipes called for orange zest, others added spices, but dates and nuts remained constant. The bread improved after a day of resting, wrapped in foil while flavors melded. Families sliced it thin and spread cream cheese across each piece, the tangy cheese balancing concentrated sweetness. Date nut bread was proper food for company, served on good china with coffee or tea. Mothers made multiple loaves each December, keeping some for the family and gifting others to neighbors as edible expressions of holiday warmth and thoughtful generosity. Fried pies appeared on Christmas tables as portable desserts that stretched fruit preserves into something special. The half-moon pastries filled with whatever jam or dried fruit the pantry held. Pie dough was rolled thin and cut into circles, spoonfuls of filling placed on one side before the dough was folded, and edges crimped tight with fork tines to seal in the sweetness. The pies were fried in hot fat until golden and crispy, the filling bubbling inside while the crust shattered with each bite. Apple, peach, and berry were common fillings, made from fruit preserved during summer harvest when orchards and bushes overflowed with abundance. The pies could be eaten by hand, making them perfect for children and for taking to church gatherings where plates were scarce. Fried pies represented the genius of transforming pantry staples into festive treats, each one a small celebration wrapped in flaky pastry. The technique allowed families to serve individual desserts that looked impressive. Creamed onions were the pearly white side dish that appeared in silver serving bowls at Christmas dinners across America, their mild sweetness balanced by rich bechamel. Small pearl onions were peeled by hand, a tedious job that left cooks weeping but yielded incomparable results. The onions were simmered until just tender, then folded into a sauce of butter, flour, cream, and sometimes a touch of nutmeg that coated each pearl in velvety richness. The finished dish looked almost like a dessert, the pale onions glistening in their creamy bath. Families passed the bowl around the table, spooning modest portions alongside roast beef or turkey. The flavor was subtle, the onions sweet and soft against the rich sauce. Making creamed onions from scratch required patience and skill, the sauce needing constant attention to prevent lumps. By the 1980s, frozen pearl onions and canned cream soups had replaced the handmade version, and eventually the dish vanished entirely from most Christmas tables. Rabbit fricacy graced Christmas tables in rural communities where wild game provided protein that store-bought meat could never match in freshness or economy. Hunters brought home rabbits throughout December, and the best were saved for holiday feasts. The rabbit was jointed and browned in bacon fat until golden, then braised in milk or cream with onions and herbs until the meat fell from the bones. The cooking liquid thickened into velvety gravy that coated every piece, served over biscuits or alongside mashed potatoes. Rabbit meat was lean and delicate, its mild flavor absorbing whatever seasonings the cook applied. Families who hunted their Christmas dinner understood the connection between land and table that store-bought food could never provide. Rabbit fricassee represented self-sufficiency, the ability to provide for family through skill rather than cash. The dish tasted of independence and the understanding that nature offered abundance. Hard candy Christmas drops were the homemade sweets that filled glass jars and candied dishes throughout the holiday season, each piece a jewel of concentrated flavor and brilliant color. Making them required cooking sugar syrup to the hard crack stage, then adding flavoring oils and food coloring before pouring onto greased marble slabs. Working quickly was essential. The candy hardened fast and shapes had to be formed in minutes before it became unworkable. Cooks used special molds or simply dropped spoonfuls that flattened into irregular rounds. Peppermint, cinnamon, lemon, and clove were favorite flavors, each given a distinctive color so guests knew what they were choosing. The finished candies were stored between layers of waxed paper in tins, where they kept for weeks without losing their snap. Church bazaars and holiday exchanges featured these homemade drops, their handmade imperfections proving they came from someone's kitchen rather than a factory. Tomato aspic was the elegant mold that separated sophisticated hostesses from casual cooks, its shimmering clarity announcing refinement on any holiday table. Tomato juice was combined with unflavored gelatin, lemon juice, Worcestershire sauce, and careful seasoning, then poured into decorative molds to set. The result was a quivering ruby ring that held its shape when unmolded onto beds of crisp lettuce. Some versions included chopped celery, olives, or shrimp suspended within like jewels in amber. The taste was intensely savory, nothing like sweet fruit gelatins that dominated other parts of the meal. Aspic required confidence, as unmolding could go wrong if the gelatin hadn't set properly. Successful unmolding brought genuine pride, the mold releasing perfectly onto its serving platter with a satisfying wobble. Tomato aspic represented formal entertaining from an earlier era, when certain dishes signaled social knowledge. Its disappearance marked changing tastes that favor simplicity over structured elegance. Which secret Christmas recipe would you beg Grandma to share? Drop your answer in the comments. Like this video and subscribe to help us keep these precious traditions alive.